Hello everyone, my name is Tran. I work as a senior exercise physiologist at the Department of Cardiology, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, with the Congenital Heart Service. I also teach exercise physiology units at the University of Sydney in both the undergraduate and postgraduate programs. The World Health Organization recommends 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise. Would you say these same recommendations apply to people with a Fontan circulation? So I think it would in general apply to people with a Fontan circulation. So the aim will be at a minimum to reach those guidelines if you can. And it's really important that we don't actually have to get to those guidelines immediately. We can slowly build ourselves up into the 150 to 300 minute range. So that is possible. And don't worry too much if you're going above those guidelines. In general, that should be okay. But again, you should talk to your medical team about that. So these guidelines are based on 150 minutes will, in the general population will result in health benefits, and achieving 300 minutes or more will achieve additional health benefits as well. Alternatively, you could do it as vigorous intensity exercise or a mixture of both. So as long as you achieve those volumes of exercise, you're going to get health benefits. But in addition to that, the World Health Organization guidelines also do encourage at least 2 days a week of muscle strengthening exercises. So in general, people with a Fontan circulation should be trying to achieve those levels. In children, the guidelines are slightly different. So if you're between the age of 5 and 17, you would like to aim for an average of 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity daily. And similarly, we want to incorporate some form of resistance exercise that will strengthen the muscles of the bones at least 3 days a week. What factors and guidelines around exercise limits should people consider with a Fontan circulation? So again, I'll refer you back to the CZAN's guidelines. That's a really good starting point, at least for exercise in terms of the level of intensity that we would recommend. If you are on medications that increase the risk of bleeding, such as warfarin, we would advise you to avoid contact sports. And we would also advise people to avoid scuba diving, as this would generally be unsafe in most people with a Fontan circulation. You mentioned not using 220-H to predict maximal heart rate for exercise prescription. So how do you recommend measuring levels of intensity and heart rate for single ventricle hearts? So 220-H is generally meant for people with a biventricular circulation. And it's based on an equation that was developed quite a long time ago. And it does have a bit of error itself. But people with a Fontan circulation are very unlikely to achieve 220-H. And we often see people plateau at about 160 to 170 beats per minute. So the maximal heart rate does tend to hover around there. So if we use 220-H, we will be significantly overestimating the intensity of exercise that we expect someone to be performing at. So alternative options is, if you have maximal heart rate from a maximal exercise test, we can use a percentage of that maximal heart rate, or you can use a percentage of heart rate reserve. So with the maximal heart rate from a maximal exercise test, we want to make sure that it is from a symptom-limited test, which means you push yourself as hard as you can until you can no longer go anymore. Some practices do stop at a certain target heart rate, and if you are asked to stop once you've achieved the target heart rate, that does not truly represent your maximal heart rate. So you should keep that in mind. Simpler and more practical methods is the talk test and RPE, which we did go through earlier. And those would be very good ways that we could implement and estimate exercise intensity. And I encourage that people do use those methods, and that will be relative to your fitness as well. So the next question is, why is it important to approach exercise incrementally? Can you provide some general examples on how you describe this with people you have consulted? So we really want people to start exercise at lower volumes and then incrementally increase, simply because it will decrease the risk of an adverse event or a musculoskeletal injury. So we know that adverse events would generally are more likely to happen to people who go from doing nothing to trying to run 6 kilometers the next day. And that's when we tend to see an increased risk of adverse events. So what we do want to do is start you off at a lower level and then slowly build you up. Again, if you're well below the World Health Organization guidelines, we would try to get you there over a few months. So we don't want you to try to hit those guidelines immediately. And a really simple example we could use is trying to increase our steps per day. So trying to increase our physical activity by increasing the steps we take per day. So let's say, for example, you currently only do 2,000 steps per day. We want to do small increments of maybe 10% per week. So every week, we will increase the steps per day by 10% until we eventually hit our target goal. So although this might take us much longer to hit our goals, it's a more appropriate way that people with a Fontan circulation, well, actually anyone should be doing in terms of progression of exercise. So that's why we would generally start at lower levels and increment people towards that target goal. We also would take into consideration your physical activity history. So if you have previously engaged in moderate to vigorous intensity exercise, will likely increase and progress the amount of exercise you do more quickly than someone who's never done exercise before. What should we be telling schools in relation to exercise for younger kids? I think the main thing we would want to emphasize and be telling schools is that kids with congenital heart disease should be encouraged to participate in as much physical activity as possible and as much sporting events as possible. Although this isn't always possible and some activities may be challenging, so things like cross-country might be quite difficult for someone with a Fontan circulation to complete, we should not restrict them from participating if they want to. And what we should be doing as well is encouraging an alternative option if some activities might not be suitable. So individual sports presents as a really good alternative to team sports, and we find that kids with congenital heart disease do tend to enjoy these a little bit more. But it's going to be individual to each child and what they enjoy. So activities such as dancing, martial arts, and rock climbing, again, some really good individual sports that can be promoted. In addition to that, sports where kids are competing against themselves, so a personal best, such as swimming or athletics, is another suitable alternative that we can encourage kids to go into. How do we as parents know when to make them rest if they haven't learned to self-pace yet? In general, we don't really need to restrict kids, and kids will generally limit themselves in the amount of activity they'll do. We will only ever limit high-intensity activities if the cardiologist has advised or the medical team has advised them to do so. So again, in general, we wouldn't limit kids, but discuss that with your medical team and they will be the most appropriate person to give you advice on if they should be limited. So this next question is about e-bikes. So the context is, my son is 13 and has tricuspid atresia. He uses an e-bike and I believe it has allowed really good circulation to his limbs over extended duration. I looked at your cardio guide and he's outside exercising for hours with a ball, riding a bike, playing cricket. He is exceeding the guidelines. Every child is individual, but my son has has a determination to be fit and it seems to be working for him. So the question is, do you know if there are any plans for studies to include the use of e-bikes? Before I address that question, I would like to say that the guidelines from our recommendations papers is more for formal and structured exercise in adolescents and adults. And so generally doesn't apply for younger kids. But it's really good that to hear that your son is participating in such a wide range of physical activity, and I think it would be okay for him to do that, and it'll be probably beneficial for him to participate in that. And that's a key factor that we think is associated with better Fontan physiology as an adult, the fact that kids are more physically active. Back to the question, do you know if there are any plans for studies to include the use of e-bikes? No, to my knowledge, we have no immediate plans to conduct a study using e-bikes, although there have been studies done in the general population that has shown that it does tend to increase physical activity levels. So if you think, or if your child uses an e-bike and it does help him increase his physical activity levels, we would encourage the use of e-bikes. Although it is something that we can potentially look into in the future, but there are no immediate plans.